How many of you have taken a class in 306? 326, the Means Family Classroom? Raise a hand. It's the upstairs to the left, yeah? All right, a lot more hands. Steve and Marianne Means, could you please stand? These are the kind people who are responsible for that classroom. Give them a round of applause. And yes, it was a setup. They didn't know I was going to do this to them, so I'm glad you're here. So, can the Busch School save civilization? Is that a strange question? Is this a surprising question? Or maybe you remember when I came to your 199, 299, 399 classes at the beginning of the semester and talked about what the mission of the school is. This is maybe not such a surprising question. Whether you agree that it's a reasonable question or not, I hope we can all agree that the world is not in great shape right now. Things are kind of a bit of a mess, right? Start with environmental issues, right? You've been hearing about these all your lives. And don't want to get into any kind of arguments about climate change or not climate change. I think everybody in the room can agree that messing up the planet, poisoning the planet, polluting the planet is not a good idea, right? Not good for us. So we have that problem, the problem of all kinds of pollution all over the planet, not making it a nice place to live. We have the problem of poverty. Even though we live in the country with the biggest economy in the world, and even though poverty has been going down over the last few years because the economy is strong, we still have problems with poverty. We still have a US poverty rate that keeps bouncing around. So basically about 50 years ago, we saw some improvements in the poverty rate. So poverty is bad, the rate going down is good, right? So it went down. But then since then, over the last 50 years, it's just bouncing around relatively stably. So there's this, we can't seem to make serious headway into the issue of poverty. At this point, we have approximately 11.9 million children living below the poverty line within the United States. It just seems crazy. Such a rich economy, that there'd be so much poverty. That's one side of the issue. In some ways, the more shocking question for me about poverty is, did you know that 63% of all American households cannot deal with a $500 emergency expense? They don't have the ready cash to deal with a $500 emergency expense. $500 is not a lot of money. As a student, you may think it's a lot of money, but as a working person, it's not a lot of money. It is shocking, simply shocking to me, that almost 2/3 of this country doesn't have $500 to deal with damage to a car or a plumbing problem or whatever. So this says that poverty is a larger issue than I think we often give it credit for. We have issues with community breakdown. Families breaking down, communities breaking down, people not helping each other out as much as they used to. So problem layering on problem, not surprising that we have what is in effect an epidemic of anxiety. So many people feeling so anxious. Probably caused by many of these other problems that I'm talking about. But did you know, for example, that the average high school student today, not long ago for some of you, has the same level of anxiety as what the average psychiatric patient had in the 1950s. So what used to be a problem only for people who are under psychiatric care is now the average for all high school students in this country. So that to me sounds like an epidemic of anxiety, right? This is very troubling. Depression is also a big problem, widespread and growing number of cases of depression. Just in the last few years, an increase of about 1/3 in terms of diagnoses of depression. Now, part of that is getting better at diagnosing it, people being more willing to talk about it, etc. But even still, that is a frighteningly high growth rate. And of course, you have heard time and again about the opioid crisis, massive scale, right? Last count, 10.3 million people in some way abusing, addicted to opioids, surrounded by this stuff, right? Some of you thinking about, yada, 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 I heard it all before, right? Environment, poverty, opioids, yeah, I've heard it all before. Does it really affect me, right? Maybe it doesn't affect me. Well, I'm curious, how many of you, just show of hands, know somebody, family member, friend, who has some kind of mental issues? Show of hands. Keep your hands up. How many of you know somebody who has some sort of drug issues? Add to the hands. How many of you know somebody who has money problems? Add to the hands. Almost everybody in the room now has their hands up, right? So this is something that touches all of us in some way. It touches our friends, it touches our relatives, and so on. Here's another one. Anybody here smoke? All right, the rest of you, don't have to put your hands up if you don't want to. The rest of you don't smoke, so you don't have to worry about lung cancer, right? Think again. Did you know that 29% of all lung cancer cases are caused by pollution in the air? So if you breathe, you have to worry about lung cancer, right? So this thing really does, all of these issues really do affect all of us. Here's another issue, and it just shows you how these problems cross over to each other. So air pollution doesn't only cause lung cancer. Recent studies, just last year, a study published showed a correlation between air pollution and depression and suicide. So bad air makes people depressed and suicidal, right? So the environmental issues cause anxiety issues, cause depression issues, and we have poverty issues, all of these things kind of mixing up into each other. What is causing all of this? So you all grew up in this environment, but it isn't normal to have numerous catastrophic kind of epidemic type issues all rising at the same time. That isn't normal, okay? It may seem normal to you because you've been surrounded by it for the last 20 years you've been alive. It's not normal. So what is causing all of this? Pope Francis, in his encyclical letter Laudato Si, makes a very interesting proposal. He says, all of this stuff is coming from being disconnected from reality. We human beings are living as if reality doesn't matter anymore. Here's a quote from the encyclical. He says, once the human being declares independence from reality and behaves with absolute dominion, the very foundations of our lives begin to crumble. Once we're disconnected from reality, everything starts to go wrong. He goes on to say, when we fail to acknowledge as part of reality the worth of a poor person, of a human embryo, or a person with disabilities, it becomes difficult to hear the cry of nature itself. Everything is connected. So all of these things we're talking about are connected in some way. And this is the world that you are inheriting. The question I want to raise is, who's going to fix this? And some of you may think, not me, because I'm studying business. I'm going to make lots of money, live in a gated community, and be immune from all of this stuff, right? So I'm sure none of you are thinking about that, but maybe just in case. But when I ask you to raise hands, everybody's hands are going up. There's no way to hide from these things in a gated community or on a yacht or wherever, right? The issues will affect you no matter what, whether they be with your employees, if you're a manager or an entrepreneur, with your family members, with your children in the future, with your relatives, in-laws, and so on, and the air you breathe, right? If you breathe, these issues are going to bother you as well. And more importantly, you will never be really happy trying to insulate yourself from the problems of the world. All of the research shows that the happiest people in the world are the people who care for other people. So you want to be that kind of person, right? So lots and lots of big problems. And the purpose of this talk is not to depress you about all the big problems, but it's just to remind you of them and then to ask the question, who is going to fix this? Who are the major institutions that should deal with these big problems? The first one most people think about would be the federal government. Needs to be dealing with pollution issues, needs to deal with poverty issues, and so on. And of course, there's a lot for the federal government to do, but they have their own issues, their own problems, particularly the dividedness of our country and the lack of trust in the government. So here's a series of statistics from the Pew Research Center, annual or thereabouts polls of the percentage of people who trust the government in Washington all or just most of the time, okay? You can see a general decline. There's a sort of a bump, a bit of a positive move in the Reagan years, a bit of another positive move in the Clinton years, but generally speaking, the trend is not pointing in a good direction. It's heading downward. So with so little trust, so little support, it's not reasonable to expect that the federal government is going to solve all of these problems, even if they could, right? Even if they could. What's another major institution that could help with this would be the church or churches. Right? They should be concerned about things like poverty and concerned about anxiety issues, community issues, and so on. Of course, these are, and they are, but again, churches have their own issues to deal with. There's a limit in what they can do. They're not going to fix all of this for us either. So who else? What other institutions can we turn to? Here's another set of polling data. This is from Gallup. Every year they ask people how much confidence they have in different institutions. And so these are percentage, quite a lot, or a great deal of confidence. In Congress, 11% of Americans have quite a lot or a great deal of confidence in Congress. In the TV news, 18% of people have confidence in that. Big business, 23%. Newspapers, 23%. Organized labor or unions, 29%. So we're not even a third of Americans have confidence in any of these institutions so far. Public schools, our educational system, 29%. Banks, 30%. Churches, 36%. We just crossed over the 1/3 line. We're still pretty low. The medical system, 36%. The presidency, 38%. Supreme Court, 38%. We finally cross over into more than half. So 53% of this country have confidence in the police. And then the last two that people seem to have, a lot of people seem to have confidence in, would be small business, 68%, and the military, 73%. So that's the highest one in terms of major institutions that people have confidence in. Now, we're not going to ask the military to clean up our environment or deal with anxiety issues or deal with community issues. We know what their job is and they do it well. But small business, it seems to me, has a role to play to fix a lot of these issues, or at least to contribute to fixing a lot of these issues. It may seem strange to say that small business should have a responsibility for fixing issues, because we don't think of solving social and environmental problems as a job for small business. When we think of small business, that we don't think of that's what they should do. But it's not a new idea. In fact, it's a very old idea. If you go back to the Middle Ages, to the guilds, the medieval guilds were associations of craftsmen, tradespeople, and so on, that got together not just for economic reasons, but to help each other out socially and spiritually as well. So the idea of, in effect, small businesses getting together to help each other out is not a new one. And the question is, can we do it again? Can small businesses pitch in to try to heal a lot of the problems of our society? We think so. The Sioka Center here at the Busch School, some of you are involved in their work, is working with or has worked with over 300 small companies, small businesses in the Washington, D.C. area alone, the vast majority of them doing something to make the town better. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One company called 20 Tables is a food company. Their goal is to help out poverty by offering low-cost but good quality meals. $6 for a good, healthy lunch. And for every lunch you buy, they donate another lunch. And so they've given away something like 10,000 meals already. They also help out the local community and the environment by sourcing locally for their food ingredients as much as possible. So diminish how much travel and gasoline and so on is used to bring the food to us. So another company called Dignity, which is a coffee growing company, and their focus is again on environmental but also social sustainability. And their particular thing is to make sure that every person in the company involved in their chain gets the same benefits. So the president all the way down to the employees, all the way down to the farmers who are growing in third world countries, growing the coffee beans. They want to make sure that everybody's getting equal benefits. The third one I want to talk about is a company called Clean Decisions. This is a janitorial services company that we work with. That is owned, run by, and staffed exclusively by returning citizens. So citizens who have been incarcerated, who have done their time, come out, want to start out a new life and do it properly. This company hires them, and they all work together to develop good business skills, good cleaning skills, etc. So the entire company is owned, operated, run by returning citizens. So 3 examples, and there are thousands like these. Why do we not think of business typically as part of the solution? Why do we assume that business shouldn't be doing this? And there's often that assumption. And my symbol for why is this little guy. Anybody recognize President Business? How many of you saw one of the Lego movies at some point with maybe younger siblings? Okay, maybe one of your young siblings actually has a little President Business toy, So from a young age, we're learning that business is evil, right? Because you got this bad guy. The bad guy in the Lego movie is the head of a business. And yes, there's some truth. There are businesses who don't do good things. There's no question. That's why you take a business ethics class, right? You learn case after case about businesses that don't act properly. That does exist. But this reputation vastly overstates the issue. Here's a concrete example. It's a group called the Media Research Foundation. They did research, they looked at a set of movies, and they counted the number of times that there was a CEO character. 79% of the times that there's a CEO character played in the movie, the CEO character is the bad guy. So almost 80%, almost 4 out of 5 times, the CEO is pictured in the movies as the bad guy. In reality, you take the number of CEOs in any given year who are charged with any kind of criminal activity, it's less than 1%. So the movie is vastly, vastly, vastly overstating the reality. Where does this overly negative view come from? Probably many different things, but I want to point to one thing that might be a little controversial, but one thing I think causes part of this problem. And it's an article from 1970 by Milton Friedman, the title being "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." Now, you can't always blame authors for the titles of their articles because it's the editors who stick the title on. But if you read the article, this is basically the thrust of what he's saying. He's saying that the purpose of business is to maximize profits, and that's it. That the only social responsibility you have beyond that is to obey the law. There's no other responsibilities that you have. This is his argument. And this, I'm afraid, has led to some significant confusion about the meaning and role of capitalism. Okay, what exactly capitalism is supposed to do. Here's a question for all of you. This is not a rhetorical question. I'd like to know if anyone can answer this question. Who, except the faculty, who invented the word capitalism? Good man, Karl Marx, right? Did Karl Marx like capitalism? No. The word is pejorative, right? It was meant to be insulting. You're a capitalist because all you care about is capital. You don't care about social issues, so you're not a good socialist, right? So you could see why it was a negative term. What I don't understand is how we all came to accept it as the word for the market economy. We call it capitalism, this pejorative word. So there's this ambiguity about the word. Is capitalism a good thing or a bad thing, right? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? I think the problem is there's two fundamentally different things happening in this country today. We call them both capitalism, but they're totally different from each other. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. If you think of what's the role of a business, the role of a business is to do, in effect, two things. It's to create value for its customers and then to capture some of that value back as profits, right? To cover its expenses and to make profits and a return. Does both of those things. Let me explain this a bit further with a 2x2 matrix. So, for example, if you have an organization that creates value but doesn't capture any of it, what do we call that? We call it a not-for-profit or a charity, right? Because they create value for a group of people, but they don't charge anything. So they're not capturing any of that value back. That's called a charity. And you can see, so on the box there, the yes column, yes, they create value, and then on the row, no, they don't capture any value. What if I go diagonally opposite? What do you call an organization or a person who doesn't create value, but captures value? What would you call such a person? A thief, right? Exactly right, right? So you're a thief. You didn't create any value, but you took some. We call that stealing. You're a thief, right? What if you don't create or capture value? We don't have to pay attention to you. You're just an inanimate object. You don't exist, right? So, but if you're a business, you have to both create and capture value, right? You have to do both of those things. And in effect, if you do that properly, you are nothing other than a permanently sustainable not-for-profit, right? It's like you're a not-for-profit that sustains itself. The problem with not-for-profits is someone else has to give them money. Right? The government or donors have to give them money. But if you're a business, nobody has to give you money except the people you are creating value for. Okay, so here is where the two kinds of capitalisms come in. Even though every business is supposed to create value and capture value, the question is, what is your prime motivation? Why are you in business? If you are in business primarily to create value, and you know by doing that you can then capture value, but your main thing is, I go into business because I want to serve other people, I want to create value, you are doing what I like to call entrepreneurial capitalism, okay? It's capitalism trying to serve others. We call that also principled entrepreneurship. You may have heard that. You are producing goods that are truly good and services that truly serve, using the words of the document Vocation of the Business Leader, which hopefully you have all read, a Vatican document. If you're a business that primarily seeks to capture value, and you only create value to the extent that you need to just so you can capture value, if that's your primary motivation, you are practicing what I would like to call imperialistic capitalism. It's the sort of capitalism where the only purpose is to take. My goal is to go into business and get stuff for myself. And if I have to provide services or goods, I'll do that, but I'm only doing that not because I care about you, because I want your money. Okay, so that's imperialistic capitalism. Pope St. John Paul II wrote about the purpose of business, I think a beautiful passage, where he said the purpose of a business firm is not simply to make a profit, but is to be found in its very existence as a community of persons who are in various ways endeavoring to satisfy their own needs and who form a particular group at the service of the whole of society. So I put the numbers in there so you can see there are 4 things, he says, the purpose of a business. It's to make money, yes, to make profits, but also to be a community of people who are caring for their own needs, but doing so by serving society. So those are the 4 things that you need to do according to St. John Paul II, and that's exactly entrepreneurial capitalism. He went on then to distinguish between 2 types of capitalism and talk about which ones would be suitable or fitting for somebody who was a person of faith. He doesn't use the words entrepreneurial and imperialistic, that's okay. He starts out by saying, if by capitalism, he's answering the question, is capitalism acceptable for people of faith? And he says, if by capitalism is meant an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, right, and of the market and of private property, and the resulting responsibility for the means of production, as well as the role of human creativity in the economic sector, he says, then the answer is certainly in the affirmative, saying yes, this kind of capitalism is acceptable. And that is entrepreneurial capitalism, right? Capitalism in service of others. But he goes on to say, but wait, if by capitalism what you mean a system where economic freedom is not circumscribed within the rule of law, between a structure of laws and regulatory structure, which helps it be focused on human freedom in its totality, which includes the ethical and religious dimensions of life. He's saying if that's what you mean by capitalism, is something that's not bound by the rule of law, focused towards ethics and religion, then the answer is certainly negative, he says. Then no, that's not a good capitalism. So which is it? And this is why I'm proposing that there's actually 2 kinds of capitalism. The second one he's describing is imperialistic capitalism. Pope Francis had a line which you've hopefully seen before, where he says, business is a noble vocation, provided that those engaged in it see themselves as challenged by a greater meaning in life. Right? We're doing something beyond just making profits, serve the common good by striving to increase the goods of this world, make them more acceptable to everybody. That's entrepreneurial capitalism. So 2 different types, fundamentally different types of market economy. We call them both capitalism, but they're very different from each other. One, entrepreneurial capitalism, approach that leads to prosperity, to economic justice, to caring for other people. And then imperialistic capitalism, an approach that really only cares about profits, right? And just basically gives capitalism, gives business a bad name. What does this mean for all of you here? First, what I think it means is be glad you're here. Be glad you're at the Busch School. Because we're preparing you to be entrepreneurial capitalists, not imperialistic capitalists. We're preparing you to be virtuous business leaders. Okay, now comes the test. What is a virtue? How long does he count before a hand goes up and someone gives the right answer? What is a virtue? Come on, guys, we're on TV here. Don't let me down. Okay, yes. A good habit, thank you. A virtue is a good habit. Simple, right? A virtue is a good habit. Vice is a bad habit, right? I know you all know it. You're just shy. That's okay. Habits are cultivated through practice, right? We do them. They become habitual. The Cardinal Virtues, we call them Cardinal Virtues in case you ever wondered. It's not because we invented them at Catholic. They're much older than we are. But they're cardinal because they're the sort of hinge on which all the other virtues depend on. The 4 cardinal virtues, prudence is the virtue of making wise decisions. And while you're here at the Busch School, we want you to be practicing. Our goal is for you to be practicing these virtues so that they become habitual, so that you become virtuous. How do you practice prudence? Many important decisions you have to make: choosing a major, choosing internships, deciding how you spend your money, deciding which job offer to accept. So in making these decisions, you are cultivating the virtue of prudence. Justice is giving to each what they deserve. Many, many opportunities to practice the virtue of justice as a student here. Justice in terms of your studies, making sure that you work hard, you give to your studies what they deserve, you don't cheat, you don't tolerate others who cheat. To your teammates, justice to your teammates, whether they be a study team or a sports team, making sure you do your bit. To your parents, you call them regularly, right, and tell them how much fun you're having. To friends, you be supportive to them when they need you. The virtue of temperance is the habit of doing things, using good things in moderation. So food and drink in moderation. Moderation in playing video games. Those of you in my classes know I have a thing for video games. So moderation, they're not bad, just in moderation. Avoiding sexual activity outside of marriage. And again, the more you practice, the easier these things become. Fortitude or courage is the habit of doing scary things even though you're afraid. So you might think, well, I'm not a courageous person. It's okay. You just do it even though you're afraid. And practicing, again, makes it easier. So speaking up in class, so that was Congressman Fortenberry was visiting. He's teaching. Come on in and say hi. Okay, okay, there you go. Stay a minute if you can. So yeah, okay, good. We're talking about saving society, so you would know all about that. Absolutely. Good. Thank you for dropping by. Appreciate it. He's teaching the graduate students upstairs. So how do you build courage while you're here at school? You speak up in class if you don't like to do that. You volunteer for a different project. Sports is a great opportunity to build physical courage. Standing up for those who need help, right? These are all ways to practice the virtue of courage. And the key word there is practice, because the more you do it, the easier it gets, right? So if it's hard to be courageous initially, the more you try, the easier it gets, which is really wonderful, right? It's nice to be a good person, and then it just gets easier and easier to be a good person. So while you're here at the Busch School, you're cultivating virtue, you're developing business skills. The combination of both of these is really important, right? We want you to have both. Because if you just have the virtues, but you don't know how to balance your budget, then you could just be a very nice, incompetent person, right? That's not helpful. If you have the business skills, but you're not virtuous, you could actually do more damage, right? You become an imperialistic capitalist. You're not helping anybody. So the combination of both is what we're hoping to cultivate with you here. And you may be thinking, but I'm just one person. These are huge problems that we've gone through. What does one person do? Well, the first thing is that you're not alone, right? There's a whole class of you that graduates every year. And more importantly, the problems I'm talking about are not all or nothing type of problems where you either solve them all or else all the effort is wasted. Every positive interaction, every good step you make, you start a little company and you help out people in one area, that help is real. It makes their lives better. So every step, in this direction, in any direction, is going to be helpful. It's not all or nothing. But lastly, what I will say is you're also not alone because you have God's grace. So I want to talk about how God's grace works with virtue. And I'm going to use an analogy from a medieval theologian called John of St. Thomas. John of St. Thomas talks about an analogy of rowing. He says, cultivating virtue is like rowing a boat. So this is a Hobie Mirage kayak. I don't think John of St. Thomas had the Hobie Mirage kayak specifically in mind when he said this, but here's why I want to pick this as an example. It has, the Mirage kayak has these outriggers, so it makes it more stable. So what John of St. Thomas said was, cultivating virtue by your own efforts is like rowing. You're rowing the boat, okay? And the more you row, the stronger you get, the better you get at rowing, and the easier it becomes. So you're cultivating the virtue. When God's grace supervenes on your virtue, then it's like putting up a mast and unfurling a sail and then sailing that kayak, which you can do with the Hobie Mirage, which is why I picked it. And what happens now is you go from the virtue not being very difficult because you've practiced to almost feeling effortless. So at some point, you're doing courageous things that you think, I never thought I could do this. It's good to then remember, I shouldn't be upstaging myself with a cool sailboat. It really is cool, isn't it? At that point, you want to remember, this is not just me anymore. This is God's grace, is the wind in my sails, right, is moving me forward. So you struggle, you grow in virtue, you become good, the virtue becomes easier, and then along comes God's grace, and it just becomes almost effortless to be virtuous. So just to do a quick recap, world has big problems, and they're just getting bigger. Businesses can help, and you are learning how to do this, so you want to be practicing now, so you will be ready. Thank you.